By sunrise the morning after Christmas Eve in 1938, somewhere near Shamokin, Pennsylvania, the butcher's shepherd came back through the square alone. Her lead dragged behind her in the snow, leather still warm, and when the baker bent to pick it up, the smell of fresh pine pitch rose off it strong enough to burn the throat. But Elsa had been standing watch near the Nativity Lane stalls since dusk, and nobody within 2 blocks kept pine sap or resin anywhere near the Christmas market. The dog had walked out of the narrow alley that ran between the plywood manger figures just after midnight, her lead scraping the brick, and the other end of that lead hung loose and empty. Nobody saw where she had gone in. Nobody saw what walked her back out. Shamokin sits in the anthracite belt of east-central Pennsylvania, a coal town laid out in 1835, where the hard rock seams run deep and the immigrant neighborhoods press tight around the collieries and the railroad spurs that haul the coal east. By 1938, men worked the Cameron and Glenburn shafts in shifts that never stopped, and the taste of coal grit lived permanent in the back of every throat. Snow fell thin and dry that December, the kind that squeaked under boots and never packed right for throwing. The storefronts around the town square stayed open late in the week before Christmas, their windows fogged from the coal stoves inside, and the Polish and Lithuanian families who'd come over decades before to work the mines brought their children to see the Nativity Lane display the town council had built special that year. The butcher, Jan Kowalczyk, had come over from Poland before the Great War and built his trade on Shamokin Street, where the air smelled of curing meat and wood smoke even in summer. He kept Elsa, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a steady temperament and a bark low enough to be heard 3 blocks over, to watch the Christmas market stalls after dark, when the square went quiet and the brass band packed up their instruments and went home. Elsa was known. The miners' children knew they could touch her ears if they asked first. Jan's wife, Marta, kept a tin of biscuits for her on the shelf above the cutting block, and every morning Elsa walked Jan to the stall and sat outside the door until he opened for business. She was the kind of dog you could trust to work alone. The Christmas market ran for 5 nights leading up to the eve. Nativity Lane was new that year, a narrow passage between wooden stalls, just wide enough for 2 people to pass sideways if they turned their shoulders, lined on both sides with painted plywood figures of shepherds, wise men, animals, all of it lit by a string of electric bulbs strung overhead on a single wire. At the far end stood the manger scene itself, life-sized, the Holy Family cut from pine board and propped upright with wooden braces nailed into the brick wall behind them. The lane dead-ended there, no way through. You walked in 20 paces, stood before the manger, turned around, and walked back out. The priest at St. Casimir, Father Dominic, had blessed it on the opening night, and children ran through it all week long, their breath steaming white under the lights, their voices high and excited. Elsa had done her job without trouble the first 4 nights. Jan tied her lead to the corner post of his stall at the edge of the square, left her a wool blanket folded twice, and a tin bowl of water, and she sat calm through the evening, watching the crowd thin and the vendor shutters come down one by one. He came back each night near 1 in the morning to walk her home through the silent blocks where the only sound was the distant grinding of the colliery wheels turning through the graveyard shift. But the night of December 24th, when Jan returned to the square at midnight, the post stood empty. The lead was gone. The blanket lay folded where he'd left it. The water bowl was full and frozen over. Elsa was gone. He called her name twice, his voice flat and small in the cold air, and heard nothing back. The square was empty. The last of the vendor stalls were shuttered tight, their awnings pulled down, their locks snapped closed. The string of lights over Nativity Lane had been turned off at 9 o'clock when the market closed, and the mouth of the lane was a black slot between the stalls, the plywood figures inside invisible in the dark. Jan stood at the corner of his stall and called again. Then he heard it, the scrape of leather on brick, slow and rhythmic, coming closer. Elsa walked out of Nativity Lane into the square, head low, ears back, lead trailing loose behind her in the snow. She came straight to Jan and sat at his feet without a sound. He knelt beside her and ran his hands over her coat. She was calm. Her paws were clean. Her coat showed no wet, no mud, no torn hair, no sign she had run or fought or dug at anything. But when he picked up the lead from the snow, the leather was warm in his hand as if it had been held tight in a closed fist for the last quarter hour. and the smell of fresh pine pitch rose off it so thick he could taste the resin burn at the back of his tongue. He looked down Nativity Lane. The string of bulbs overhead was dark. The plywood figures inside were shadows. Nobody had been in that lane since 9 o'clock. He did not walk down it to look. He took Elsa home, woke his brother-in-law Stanislaw, and came back an hour later with 2 men from the Cameron shaft and lanterns and an axe. They walked Nativity Lane end to end, boots crunching through the snow, lantern light swinging across the painted plywood shepherds and wise men that lined both sides. Every figure stood where it had been nailed. The manger scene at the back wall was untouched, the Holy Family staring forward with their flat painted eyes. The snow inside the lane lay smooth and crusted over, unbroken as table sugar, with no paw prints, no boot prints, no drag marks where a dog's lead might have trailed. But near the center of the lane, directly beneath the dark string of bulbs, the snow showed a single shallow depression, oval-shaped and smooth-edged, as if something heavy and warm had rested there long enough to melt through the top crust without breaking it clean through. The men stood over it in silence. One of them, a Lithuanian miner named Petras Rutkauskas, who worked the lower gap seam and had 6 children at home, crossed himself and turned back toward the square without waiting for the others. He did not speak. At dawn, Jan opened his stall as he always did. He unlocked the door, pushed the shutters back, and set the cutting block in its place by the window. The window glass facing the square, a thick pane set in a wooden frame that Jan cleaned every morning with vinegar and rag, was spotless. But pressed into the inside surface of that glass, clear as a wax seal, was the pad of a dog's front paw, each toe distinct, the central pad wide and deep. It was pressed from the inside. The stall had been locked all night. Jan carried the only key on a cord around his neck. There had been no dog inside when he opened the door. There was no moisture on the glass, no breath fog, no smear of mud or snow, just the print, and when Jan tried to wipe it away with his sleeve, it stayed exactly as it was. By mid-morning, word had traveled through the Polish and Lithuanian blocks faster than the mine whistle carried over the rail yard. Men coming off the graveyard shift at Cameron stopped by the butcher's stall to see the paw print before going home to sleep. Women coming back from early mass at St. Casimir crossed the square in their dark coats and shawls to look at Nativity Lane in full daylight, and most of them stopped at the mouth of it, hands folded, and did not go farther. Some of the older women, the ones who still spoke more Polish than English, said they could hear something from inside the lane. Not a voice, not a bark, but a soft, repeated sound like a dog sneezing behind the plywood stable where no dog stood. The children heard it too. They stood at the edge of the square and pointed, but none of them would go close. Father Dominic came by before noon and stood in front of the lane for a long time, his hands folded inside his coat, his breath steaming in the cold. He said nothing to the small crowd that had gathered. Then he walked back to the parish house beside St. Casimir and rang the bell 13 times. Though it was not the hour for any service and the sound carried cold and wrong across the rooftops, each stroke landing too slow and too heavy. He locked the church doors early that afternoon and did not open them again until the morning of the 26th. Nobody asked him why. People in Pennsylvania still remember that Christmas. Not because it was joyful. The miners who lived near Shamokin in 1938 will tell you, if you ask careful and do not press, that after that night nobody walked through Nativity Lane. Not even in daylight, not even when the sun was high, and the coal grit blew visible through the air like ash. The town council left the plywood figures standing through New Year because nobody wanted to be the first to go in and take them down, but the string of lights overhead was never turned on again. By the time they finally dismantled the lane in early January, the snow inside it had gone gray and strange, and the men who carried the boards out to the rail yard for burning said the wood smelled wrong, not of paint or pine, but of something older and closer to the ground, something that had been still for a long time and had decided to move. The trouble began earlier than most people knew. By the time Jan found Elsa walking out of Nativity Lane just after midnight on Christmas Eve, 3 other people in Shamokin had already heard or seen something they could not explain, and none of them had thought to mention it until the morning of the 25th, when the paw print appeared pressed into the butcher's glass from the inside. The first was Emil Novak, who ran the evening shift at the Cameron Colliery and and walked home past the square every night near 11:30. On the 24th, he crossed the square just as the brass band was packing their instruments into wooden cases, the last notes of Silent Night still hanging thin and flat in the cold air. He said later that as he passed the mouth of Nativity Lane, he heard a dog sneeze. Not a bark, not a whine, but a sneeze, short and wet and close, coming from somewhere behind the plywood stable at the far end of the lane where the manger scene stood. He stopped and looked down the passage. The string of lights overhead was still on, the bulbs casting long shadows from the painted figures that lined both sides. He could see all the way to the back wall. There was no dog. He called out, thinking maybe one of the vendors' mutts had gotten loose and wandered in and heard nothing back. He stood there for a moment, breath steaming, and then went home. He did not think about it again until the next morning. The second was a widow named Bronislawa Zayak, who lived on the second floor above the bakery at the edge of the square, and could not sleep well since her husband Jerzy died in the Lower Gap cave-in 2 years before. She sat by her window most nights with the lights off and watched the square below, the empty vendor stalls, the snow gathering in the corners where the wind pushed it. She said that just after midnight on Christmas Eve, the string of lights over Nativity Lane, which had been turned off at 9 o'clock sharp when the market closed, began to light up one bulb at a time, starting from the square end and moving down the passage toward the manger at the back, not all at once, one by one, slow and deliberate, like someone walking down the lane flipping switches, except there were no switches to flip along the way. The whole string was wired to a single junction box at the vendor master's stall, and that box had been locked off hours before with a padlock the size of a fist. She watched the lights go on in order, all the way to the end, and then go dark again the same way, backward, one bulb at a time until the lane was black again. She did not go downstairs to look. She pulled the curtain closed and sat in the dark until morning. The third was Father Dominic himself, who had been working late in the parish office at St. Casimir, finishing the Christmas attendance records when he heard the bell in the tower above him begin to toll. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 20 past midnight. The bell rang once, twice, 3 times, slow and deliberate, and kept ringing. He counted every stroke. 13. Then silence. He sat very still for a moment, then stood and went outside into the churchyard. The air was cold and motionless. No wind, no sound except the distant grinding of the colliery wheels turning through the night shift. He looked up at the bell tower, the rope that hung down from the bell mechanism inside, the rope he pulled every morning for the Angelus, swayed slightly back and forth as if someone had just let go of it. He walked to the base of the tower, climbed the narrow stairs to the bell chamber, and checked the mechanism. Everything was in place. The clapper hung centered. The rope was still. He locked the rope off with an iron pin he kept for storms and went back down. In the morning, when people began talking about the dog and the lights and the paw print on the butcher's glass, he told them what he had heard. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked him to explain. By mid-morning on Christmas Day, a group of men had gathered outside Jan Kowalczyk's butcher stall in the square. Most of them were miners from Cameron and Glen Burn, men who knew how to organize a search in difficult terrain and how to move through unstable ground without losing their heads or their nerve. They stood in a loose circle, breath steaming in the cold, hands deep in their coat pockets, stamping their boots against the frozen brick to keep the blood moving. Someone said what everyone was already thinking. If a dog went missing in that lane and came back alone with no sign of where it had been, and if lights turned on by themselves and bells rang at the wrong hour, then something in Nativity Lane was wrong and needed to be checked again, this time in full daylight, this time with enough men to cover every inch of ground. They formed a line, 11 men shoulder to shoulder, and walked Nativity Lane from the square end to the manger and back 3 times. They moved slow and methodical, the way they moved through a mine when checking for bad air or loose timber. They checked every plywood figure, every wooden brace, every painted shepherd and wise man. They checked the ground, the brick walls on either side, the overhead wire that held the string of bulbs. They tapped the boards with their knuckles, listening for hollow spaces. They found nothing. The snow inside the lane was smooth and unbroken except for the boot prints they themselves had left the night before, when Jan and his brother-in-law and the 2 Cameron men had walked through with lanterns. But near the center of the passage, Just beneath where the string of lights hung lowest, where the shallow oval depression had been visible in the snow the night before, there was now a second mark. A long scrape, thin and straight, about 8 inches long, as if something heavy had been dragged forward a few inches through the snow and then stopped. It had not been there the night before. Every man who had walked the lane with Jan in the early hours of Christmas morning swore to it. One of the younger men, a Pole named Tadeusz who worked the Glen Burn hoist and was not yet 25, bent down close to the scrape and held his hand a few inches above it without touching the snow. "It is warm," he said quietly. The others leaned in. The air just above the mark felt different, not hot, but noticeably less cold than the air around it, as if something had passed through recently and left a faint trail of warmth behind. The difference was slight, but real. You could feel it if you held your hand steady. Nobody put their fingers directly on the snow. They straightened up, looked at each other, and kept walking. By noon, women from the Polish and Lithuanian blocks had joined the effort, bringing thermoses of black tea and rolls wrapped in cloth and setting up a table on the far side of the square, where the men could come for food without leaving the search area. They did not walk the lane themselves, but they stood at the mouth of it in their dark coats and headscarves and watched, and some of them began tying strips of torn white cloth to the posts of the vendor stalls that lined both sides of the passage. It was an old custom from the mine searches, a way to mark what ground had been covered and what still needed checking, so no one walked the same stretch twice and wasted time. By early afternoon, Nativity Lane looked like it had been dressed for a wake. The men widened their search to the alleys and side streets around the square. They checked the coal yards behind the rail spur, the narrow gap between St. Casimir and the parish hall, the loading dock at the back of the baker's building, the fenced lot where the vendor carts were stored in winter. They found nothing. No sign of disturbance, no tracks, no broken locks. But as they moved through the blocks, more people came forward with things they had heard or seen the night before that they had not thought important or strange until now, in the cold light of Christmas afternoon. A girl named Zofia Wilk, 9 years old, said she had been looking out her bedroom window on the second floor of her family's house just after midnight and saw the lights in Nativity Lane turn on and off by themselves in a line, exactly the way Bronislawa Zayak had described. A man named Kęstutis, who worked the graveyard shift at the colliery, said he had heard a low knocking sound coming from somewhere near the square as he walked to his shift around 11:45, 3 knocks in a row. A pause, then 3 more. But when he stopped to listen closer, it did not come again, and he kept walking. By late afternoon, as the daylight began to fail and the sky over the ridge west of Shamokin went the color of cold ash, the older men, the ones who had worked the deep mines since before the Great War, and who had seen how quickly hope could collapse into grief during a search, began to speak quietly among themselves about what should and should not be done going forward. One of them, a Ukrainian named Hrihori Bondar, who had helped pull bodies out of the Cameron shaft after the 1924 collapse, said it plain and loud enough for the younger men to hear. "We do not send anyone into that lane alone. Not now, not after dark. 2 men minimum, and they stay where we can see them from the square at all times." The others nodded. It was not a rule anyone had to write down or vote on. It was simply understood. As the sun dropped fully behind the ridge and the square began to fill with shadow, the men gathered one last time at the mouth of Nativity Lane. They stood in a loose group, some of them holding unlit lanterns even though it was not yet full dark, and looked down the narrow passage between the plywood figures. The painted shepherds and wise men stared back with flat eyes. The string of lights overhead was off. The white cloth strips tied to the posts hung limp and motionless in the still air. And then, from somewhere deep inside the lane, near the back where the manger scene stood propped against the brick wall, they heard it. Soft, quick, unmistakable. 2 short sounds like a dog sneezing behind painted wood. Every man there heard it. Nobody moved. The sound did not repeat. One of the younger men took a step forward, and Hrihori Bondar put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head once. Slowly, one by one, the men turned and walked back across the square toward the streets that led to their homes, and nobody spoke a word until they were well past the vendor stalls and into the blocks beyond where the streetlights burned yellow through the coal grit in the air. That night, families in Pennsylvania kept their children inside and their doors locked, and the square in Shamokin sat empty and silent under a sky that held no stars and no moon. The search continued for 9 days, not because anyone believed they would find Elsa. The dog was home, safe, sleeping on the rug beside the stove in Jan's kitchen, but because something had happened in Nativity Lane that no one could name or explain. And the men of Shamokin knew that leaving a question like that unanswered was the same as leaving a shaft unsealed after a collapse. They organized the effort the way they organized mine rescues, with shifts and assignments and a log kept in pencil on butcher paper tacked to the wall of the vendor master's shack at the edge of the square. Men signed their names when they arrived and crossed them off when they left. No one went into the lane alone. 2 men minimum, always within sight of the square, always with someone watching from the mouth of the passage. Women brought food and thermoses of tea and stayed on the far side of the square, where they could see but not be seen too close. Children were not allowed past the bakery, and the older boys who tried to sneak closer were sent home with warnings that carried weight. On the second day, they brought in 2 more dogs, both hounds from a farm outside town that were used for tracking lost livestock. The dogs were led to the mouth of Nativity Lane, given Jan's work gloves to smell, and released. Both animals walked 3 paces into the passage, stopped, sat down, and would not move farther no matter how hard their handler pulled the leads. One of them whined low and continuous. The other lay flat on the snow and refused to stand. The handler, a man named Bodan who had worked with tracking dogs for 20 years, shook his head and said he had never seen that behavior before except once, years ago, near a mine entrance 2 hours before a roof came down. On the 3rd day, they widened the search to the rail yard and the coal sidings, thinking maybe something had been moved or stored near the square that might explain the smell of pine pitch on Elsa's lead. They found nothing. The only lumber near the square was stacked in the yard behind the hardware store, and it was all kiln-dried oak and maple, no pine, no resin, nothing that would leave that thick smell on leather. Jan kept the lead in a tin box in the back room of his shop, and twice a day he opened the box and checked. The smell was still there, faint now but unmistakable, and the leather, though it had been stored in a cold, unheated room for 3 days, still felt faintly warm to the touch when he first picked it up, as if it had been lying in the sun. On the 5th day, Father Dominic opened the church again and held a special mass for the community. 50 people attended, most of them women and older men who no longer worked the shafts. He did not mention Nativity Lane directly, but in his homily, he spoke about unseen things, about how the world holds more than what the eye can measure, and about the importance of humility before mysteries that do not yield to human effort. Afterward, several of the women lit candles at the side altar beneath the icon of Saint Casimir and prayed in Polish and Lithuanian, and Father Dominic did not stop them even though it was not a feast day, and the candles were meant for other purposes. On the 7th day, something changed. Tadeusz, the young hoist operator from Glen Burn, was walking the lane with Hrihori Bondar in the early afternoon, when he saw something white tucked into the gap between 2 planks of the plywood stable at the back of the passage, near where the manger scene stood. He called Hrihori over, and together they pulled the object free. It was a folded piece of paper, clean, no water damage, no coal dust. Tadeusz unfolded it carefully. Inside, in pencil, someone had written 3 words in neat block letters. She came back. Hrihori took the paper from him and held it up to the light. The handwriting was clear and deliberate, not rushed, not shaky. It looked recent. The pencil marks were dark and sharp-edged, not faded. He turned the paper over. The back was blank. He looked at Tadeusz, then back down the lane toward the square where 4 other men stood watching. "Who put this here?" Hrihori said quietly. Tadeusz shook his head. They had walked this section of the lane twice already that morning. The gap between the planks had been empty. Hrihori folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket without saying anything more. By evening, word of the note had spread through the blocks around the square, and the men gathered again outside the vendor master's shack to decide what it meant. Some said it was a prank, maybe one of the younger boys who had slipped past the watchers. Others said it was a message from someone who knew more than they were saying, maybe someone who had seen what happened to Elsa that night and was too afraid to speak openly. A few said nothing at all, but their faces showed what they were thinking. that the note had not been there in the morning and that no one had gone into the lane between the second walkthrough and the moment Tadeus found it, and that the handwriting looked too steady and too clean to have been written by someone in a hurry or in fear. Father Dominic came to look at the note. He unfolded it on the table in the shack and studied it for a long time without touching it. Then he folded it again and handed it back to Hryhori. "Keep it safe," he said. "Do not lose it. It may be needed later." He did not say for what. That night, theories began to form, not in any official way, but in the way people talk when they are afraid and trying to make sense of something that resists sense. Some said Elsa had been taken by someone with a grudge against John, maybe a competitor or a debtor, and that the dog had escaped and found her way back. But that did not explain the warm lead, the smell of pine pitch, the lights turning on by themselves, the bell ringing 13 times, the paw print pressed from the inside of a locked stall. Others said it was something natural, a trick of the cold air, or the coal dust, or the way sound carried strange in the narrow space between buildings, but that did not explain the note, or the way the dogs refused to enter the lane, or the soft sneezing sound that multiple people had heard coming from behind painted wood where no dog stood. A few, mostly the older men who had worked the deep shafts and who had heard the stories collected by the folklorist George Corson about mine spirits and knockers and voices in the dark, said it was something else entirely. They said the land around Shamokin had been torn open for coal for more than 100 years, that the shafts went down hundreds of feet and spread out under the town in networks no one had fully mapped, and that sometimes the ground remembers what has been done to it and gives back in ways that do not follow the rules people expect. They did not say the word ghost. They did not say spirit. They just said that some places, after enough disturbance, stopped behaving the way they should, and that Nativity Lane, built on brick and coal grit in a square where the air never fully cleared of smoke, might be one of those places. Nobody argued with them. Nobody laughed. On the 8th day, Jan went back to work. He opened his stall as usual, set out his knives and his cutting board, and served the customers who came, but he did not take Elsa with him, and he did not tie her lead to the post at the edge of the square. He left her at home, and when people asked why, he said only that she was tired and needed rest. In the afternoon, his brother-in-law Stanislaw came by the stall and told him quietly that the tin box where Jan kept the lead, the box in the cold back room, was now holding 2 leads, both identical, both the same worn brown leather with the same brass clasp, both faintly warm to the touch. Jan closed the stall early and went home. He opened the box. Stanislaw was right. There were 2 leads. Jan had only ever owned one. He did not tell anyone else about the second lead. He wrapped both of them in a flour sack, put the sack in the bottom of a trunk in the cellar, and locked the trunk. That night he and Marta sat at the kitchen table long after the children were asleep, and Jan told her what Stanislaw had found. Marta, who had grown up in a village in Galicia and who remembered stories her grandmother told about things that followed people home from the forest, said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "We do not open that trunk again, not for any reason. You understand?" Jan nodded. By the 9th day the search had stopped. There was nothing more to find. The lane had been walked, measured, checked, and rechecked. The plywood figures had been examined. The ground had been sifted. The note had been read and reread and filed away in Father Dominic's desk at the parish office, where no one but he could see it. The men went back to their shifts at Cameron and Glen Burn. The women went back to their kitchens and their children. The square returned to its usual rhythms, except for one change that everyone noticed but no one discussed openly. After the 9th day, no one in Pennsylvania walked through Nativity Lane anymore, not even in full daylight, not even when the sun was high and the square was crowded with vendors and customers and children running between the stalls. The older hands in Shamokin, the ones who had lived through collapses and strikes and the hard years when the seams ran thin, began telling the younger men a new rule, the same way they taught them which shafts to avoid and which foremen to trust. They said, "You do not go into narrow places alone after dark, especially places that dead end and have no second exit, especially places where a dog refuses to walk." They did not explain why. They did not need to. The younger men learned fast. The town council dismantled Nativity Lane in the second week of January 1939. They did it early in the morning, before most people were awake, and they did it fast. 4 men pulled the plywood figures down, loaded them onto a flatbed truck, and hauled them out to the rail yard where they burned them in a pile with old ties and scrap lumber. Nobody asked to keep any of the pieces. Nobody took photographs. By noon the lane was gone, and the vendor stalls that had framed it on both sides were pushed back to widen the square, and by the end of the week you could not tell, just by looking, that Nativity Lane had ever existed. But people in Pennsylvania remembered. They remembered because Jan Kowalczyk never brought Elsa back to the square after that Christmas, and because Father Dominic never held another public blessing for any structure built in that part of town, and because the women who had tied white rags to the posts during the search kept those rags and would not throw them away, folding them instead into the bottoms of trunks and drawers where they stayed for years, untouched, like relics of something that should not be spoken about but could not be forgotten. By 1940, Shamokin's population had begun to decline. The anthracite seams were running thin, and the companies were cutting shifts and closing marginal shafts. Men who had worked the Cameron and Glen Burn collieries for 20 years found themselves laid off with no warning and no pension. Some families left for Pittsburgh or Scranton or Philadelphia, looking for work in steel or textiles or anything that paid steady. Others stayed, holding on to their homes and their churches and the small businesses they had built over decades. Even as the storefronts around the square began to empty, and the coal grit in the air thinned to something lighter and less permanent. Jan kept his butcher shop open through the war years and into the 1950s. He served the families that remained, the ones who could not leave or would not leave, and he never spoke about what had happened that Christmas in 1938 unless someone asked him directly, and even then he said very little. Elsa lived another 6 years and died quietly in her sleep in 1944, and Jan buried her in the yard behind his house under a stone he carved himself with her name and the years. He did not carve the date of Christmas Eve. He did not need to. Everyone who knew him knew what that night had taken from him, even if they could not name it exactly. The lead, or the 2 leads, depending on who you asked and when, stayed locked in the trunk in Jan's cellar until he died in 1961. His son Marek, who had been 8 years old the Christmas Elsa disappeared, and who had grown up hearing the story in whispers and fragments, opened the trunk after the funeral to sort through his father's belongings. He found the flour sack at the bottom, opened it, and found one lead inside. Just one. Brown leather, brass clasp, worn smooth from years of use. He held it up to the light. It smelled faintly of old leather and nothing else. No pine pitch, no resin. He put it back in the sack, closed the trunk, and never opened it again. Years later, when his own children asked him about the story their grandfather had been part of, he told them only that some things are better left where they are, in the dark, where they cannot follow you home. Father Dominic kept the note, the one Tadeusz had found folded between the planks of the plywood stable, the one that read, "She came back," in neat block pencil, in his desk at the parish office for the rest of his life. He showed it to only 3 people: the bishop who came to visit St. Casimir in 1945, a younger priest who replaced him when he retired in 1958, and a historian from Bucknell University who came to Shamokin in 1963 to collect oral histories from the mining families. The historian asked if he could photograph the note. Father Dominic said no. He said some things are not meant to be copied or preserved in that way, that they exist as witnesses to events that resist ordinary documentation. The historian did not argue. He left Shamokin the next day and never came back. Over the years, the story changed shape the way stories do when they are told and retold in kitchens and church basements and on porches in the summer when the heat makes people talk longer than they should. Some versions said it was a child who disappeared, not a dog. Some said it was a night watchman, or a vendor, or one of the priests from St. Casimir. Some said the figure in the manger came alive and walked through the square, leaving no footprints in the snow. Some said the whole lane moved 6 inches to the left overnight and no one noticed until morning. None of these versions were true, but they circulated anyway the way ghost stories do, filling in the gaps that the real events had left open. But the people who had been there, the ones who had walked the search grid and tied the white rags and stood at the mouth of the lane in the cold January wind. They told a different story. They told it carefully and only to people they trusted. And they told it the same way every time, with the same details in the same order. The dog walking out alone with the lead dragging behind her, the lead warm and smelling of fresh pine pitch, the lights turning on one by one down the lane with no hand at the switch, the bell ringing 13 times, the paw print pressed from the inside of a locked stall, the note that appeared where no note had been. They did not add. They did not embellish. They simply repeated what they had seen and heard, and when someone asked what it meant, they said they did not know and did not care to guess. The rule, though, the rule stayed. Even after the generation that had lived through that Christmas began to die off in the 1960s and 1970s, the rule persisted. Parents in Pennsylvania still told their children not to walk alone in narrow places after dark, especially places that dead-ended with no second exit. Teachers in the Catholic schools around Shamokin still included it in the informal lessons they gave to children about safety and common sense. Stay in groups, keep to lighted streets, do not answer if you hear your name called from a place you cannot see into. The children learned. They did not always know why, but they learned. And when they grew up and had children of their own, they passed the rule on, and it became part of the landscape the same way the empty shafts and the culm piles and the old company houses became part of the landscape. Present, persistent, no longer questioned. By the 1980s, Shamokin's population had dropped to less than half what it had been in 1938. The square still stood, but many of the storefronts were boarded up, and the vendor stalls that had once filled the space during the Christmas season were gone. The town held a small holiday market in December, but it was nothing like the old days, and no one suggested building anything like Nativity Lane again. When a developer proposed putting up a seasonal display in the square in 1985, a group of older residents showed up at the town council meeting and spoke against it, not loudly, not angrily, but firmly. The proposal was dropped without a vote. In 1997, a journalist from Philadelphia came to Shamokin to write a feature about the decline of Pennsylvania coal towns. She interviewed several longtime residents, including a woman named Zofia Wilk, who had been 9 years old the Christmas Elsa disappeared, and who was now in her late 60s. Zofia told her the story, all of it, and the journalist took notes and nodded and asked follow-up questions about details and dates. Then she asked Zofia what she thought had really happened. Zofia looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You can believe it was someone playing a trick, or you can believe it was the cold doing strange things, or you can believe it was something else. But whatever you believe, you do not walk into places like that alone. Not here. Not in Pennsylvania." The journalist printed the story, but she left that part out. People around Shamokin, Pennsylvania still tell the story, not often, not to outsiders, but if you ask the right people in the right way, they will tell you about the Christmas in 1938 when a butcher's dog walked into Nativity Lane and came back out alone, and how the lead she wore smelled of pine pitch and stayed warm for days in a cold room, and how a second lead appeared in a locked trunk and then vanished again years later, and how the bell at St. Casimir rang 13 times at midnight with no one in the tower. They will tell you that the town dismantled the lane fast and burned the wood without ceremony, and that no one has built anything like it since, and that children growing up in those blocks still learn, without being told why, not to walk alone in narrow, dead-end places after the sun goes down. They will tell you there are 3 ways to explain what happened. The human way. Someone took the dog as a prank, returned her, and staged the rest to scare people. The natural way. The cold and the coal dust and the compressed air in the narrow lane created illusions of warmth and sound that people mistook for something stranger. And the impossible way. That something in that passage, something drawn by the painted figures or the electric lights or the particular arrangement of wood and brick and snow, became briefly present in a way that left marks no ordinary presence should leave, and that when it let the dog go, it kept something of her and left something of itself behind. Which version makes sense? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one that people in Pennsylvania still will not say out loud even now, more than 80 years later, in the cold months when the snow squeaks underfoot and the air tastes of smoke and old iron? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.